So before we delve into the Phillips curve, let's just really quickly kind of take a step back to when we first started to learn about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we talked about the different zones that we have, right? If we have a upward sloping curved short run aggregate supply curve. Actually, let's draw this a little bit better. Better than that. Okay. And then we have a long run aggregate demand curve. Sorry, long run aggregate supply curve. There's no such thing as long run aggregate demand. Long run aggregate supply curve right here. And then recall in this particular chart, we had three different circumstances of aggregate demand. One of them that relates to the Keynesian case, when we're far below our potential GDP, our full employment GDP. We have one of them where we are close to it in what's called our intermediate zone. And we have one of them that is at our neoclassical zone. And so the reason for these different zones has to do with where these equilibria are in relation to that full employment number, right? That gap, that distance between them. And so that gap between them, right, which has to do with the unemployment, ends up being a big determinant of what kinds of policies we may want to implement. And when we're talking about policies to implement, well, we're going to end up talking about this curve that is a complete departure from this curve right here, right, where we have price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis, right? When we're talking about the Phillips curve, we're going to have new things on the axis. How exciting. I know, just potential GDP. So now, instead of having price level on the y-axis, we're going to have the inflation rate. And then instead of having real GDP on the x-axis, we're going to have the unemployment rate. And what we find over time is that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. We can be at this situation, A, where we're at a 5% inflation rate and 4% unemployment, or the fiscal spending can decline, the monetary policy can tighten, and we can end up going down to a 2% inflation rate. But then the trade-off is our unemployment is going to shoot up to 7%. So the Phillips curve represents a trade-off. If one is higher, the other one must be lower. If the government reduces the inflation to 2%, that's going to increase unemployment by 3%. That's what the Phillips curve is showing us. This negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. Now, this is something that used to hold firmly in the 1970s, and then it started to, it held firmly in the 1960s, And then in the 1970s, it kind of started to disappear. We didn't really see it. It started to emerge in a different place, right? So one of the things that we see is we see this thing moves around over time, right? So this thing doesn't stay in the same place. You know, over time it might shift to the right, it might shift to the left. So this thing is what we call structurally sensitive, right? Like we need to look at this in the confines and the context that we are trying to analyze. So looking at the Phillips curve from the 1960s is not going to be a great indication about what is going to happen if inflation goes from its current, 5.5%, 6% down to 2%. So there's been some talk about, it shifting. There's been some talk about, it becoming steeper, right? So, but generally, it's felt that there is this negative relationship. There is this trade-off between inflation and unemployment, that as a general rule.